The metering modes in modern cameras can be confusing, but in certain situations, choosing the right metering mode can absolutely be the difference between getting the most epic shots and, well, missing them entirely. And, well, I've been doing photography for around 2 years now, and learning how to use the correct metering mode in the right situation has been one of the most impactful lessons that I've come across. And additionally, professionals meter their shots using a sneaky camera setting that most amateurs don't even realize exist. And so do yourself a favor, and instead of spending a bunch of time researching new camera gear, first make sure that you're getting the full potential of the gear that you currently own. Okay, so first things first, what is light metering anyway, right? Well, metering is how your camera evaluates the amount of light that is hitting the camera's sensor, so then it can try and help you out by suggesting settings like shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Way back when, photographers would carry these little things, light meters, which they would put in front of their subject, and it would give them a suggestion of the camera settings to use. These light meters use incident light, which is light coming directly from the sun and is potentially more accurate compared to the way that we do things with more modern cameras. With modern digital cameras, instead of incident light, we meter our scenes using reflected light. This is where the light from the sun hits our subject, and then we measure the light in the scene after it's reflected off our subject through our camera lens into our camera. Our digital cameras then give a light meter readout on the screen on the back of the camera or through the digital viewfinder. And if the camera believes that your scene is perfectly exposed, then the light meter will read a big fat whopping 0. Now, alternatively, if the camera believes that the scene is underexposed or basically too dark, then the light meter will read less than 0. And, well, you guessed it right, if your camera thinks that your image is overexposed or too bright, the number will be more than 0, which then leads us on to the question: how does the camera calculate whether our photo is underexposed, overexposed, or perfectly exposed? Well, that's where the main 3 metering modes come in. Now, obviously, your camera isn't sentient. I mean, hello? No, I don't think so. And so you can think of your camera's metering modes as being the criteria that the camera uses to judge the exposure of a scene, as opposed to a sentient camera telling you what is the best because it understands art, light, and the nuances of the human nature. So with that said, first up, let's talk about matrix evaluative or multi-metering. Yes, a bunch of different names across a bunch of different brands for the same thing, which is kind of dumb, but here we are. This is most likely the default metering mode on your camera, and for good reason. This is the jack of all trades metering mode. When you're in matrix mode, your camera looks at the entirety of the scene and tries to determine the best overall exposure. So imagine you're shooting a landscape scene with a bright blue sky, a few fluffy white clouds, and some green grass and some big rocks. Well, matrix metering is going to look across all of those elements: the brightness of the sky, the midtones in the grass, the shadows behind the rocks, and it's going to try and find a happy medium that makes the whole scene look fantastic. And this is obviously great for times where you want everything in the photo to be evenly exposed, or as evenly exposed as it can be, without one area being too bright or other areas being too dark. And let me be dead straight with you here, I leave my camera set on matrix mode almost 100% of the time. It's just such a versatile mode that works for almost all shooting situations. But of course, there are always exceptions to the rule. I mean, what if you're shooting a portrait and you want to prioritize your subject's face so it's properly exposed rather than the background? Well, this is where other metering modes can come in handy. Okay, so next up we have center weighted metering, and as the name suggests, this mode gives priority to the central area of the frame when the camera is trying to determine the exposure. Now, because the camera is only focusing on exposing one part of the frame, well, it can be a lot more consistent and predictable and reliable compared to the previous matrix metering mode that's trying to cover the entirety of the frame. So let me give you a practical example here. Let's say you're taking a photo of your dog against a bright, sunny background. Well, with matrix metering, the camera is going to try and balance the exposure between your dog's face, which is the bit that we actually care about, and then the bright background and sky. This is going to result in a photo where the subject is going to be underexposed because the camera is trying to balance out the subject and the background altogether. But the thing is, obviously, we don't really care all that much about the background, and most likely we'd much rather have our subject exposed correctly so we can see Walter's wonderful face. So if we were to shift over to center weighted metering and the subject is in the middle of the frame, the camera is going to prioritize this area, and in this case our dog's face is going to have the exposure adjusted appropriately within the camera so that he stands out. He's not blown out of highlights or crushed in the shadows. He looks as wonderful as what he does in real life. The consequences of this are that the background might end up a little bit overexposed, but again, what we care about is the subject. But what if, Will, I hear you cry, what happens if the subject isn't in the center of the frame? Well, that's where spot metering comes in. Spot metering is like the sniper rifle of metering modes. It only measures the light in a tiny user-selected area of your frame. So in other words, when you're in spot metering mode, your camera is only going to measure the brightness of the area under your selected focus point to determine then the exposure for the entirety of the frame. And this is really, really useful if you are doing any photography in tricky lighting situations, where perhaps your subject is a lot brighter or a lot darker than the rest of the scene. For example, in this shot, if I let the camera meter in matrix mode, it would see all of the white snow. It would assume that this was bright sunlight and it would dramatically underexpose the image. Additionally, because the red hut isn't in the center of the frame, center point metering could fail for the same reasons as well, because the hut wouldn't be under that point. So this is where I would potentially use spot metering. I'd put the spot over the hut and I'd meter against that. And that is it. That is the main 3 metering modes. And look, there are other metering modes, but I just don't think most amateur photographers like you and I are ever going to have to really bother with them. Matrix, center, and spot metering are probably all that you're ever really going to need. And remember, the goal isn't to use the correct metering mode. The goal is to get the correct exposure for the image that you're trying to capture. And so there's always going to be some exceptions to the rule here. And no matter what metering mode you're actually using, you can always choose what's called exposure compensation to fine tune the exposure of your image one way or another. Now, I do cover exposure compensation in more detail in my training, the 30-day Landscape Photography Fundamentals course, where I help photographers shortcut the process to start taking images that make their friends, family, and social media say wow when they see them. So if you want to rapidly improve your photography in the next 30 days, click the link in the description and I'll see you over in the training. But yeah, exposure compensation in a nutshell lets you tell your camera, communicate with your camera, that the scene is a little bit too dark or it's a little bit too bright and you want to nudge it one way or another. And interestingly, it's really important for me to note here, and for you to really understand this, that just because your camera says that your image is over or underexposed, it doesn't mean that that exposure can't be adjusted after the image has been shot. We can almost use post-processing as a little bit of a time machine here. Because if you're using a modern digital camera, you're going to have 1, 2, maybe even 3 or 4 stops of exposure that you can add or subtract in Lightroom after you've taken your image. For example, in this photo, my Sony a7R IV was telling me, it was screaming at me that it was at least 4 stops underexposed. But, well, I did that on purpose because I didn't want to blow out the highlights in the scene. I knew that I could take this image, throw it into Lightroom, increase the shadows, process the image, and then the final result is not going to be underexposed at all. And my point here is that the light meter on your camera is a guide to help you, the artist, the photographer, to choose the exposure that's going to work for the image that you're trying to take. You don't have to change your settings to get to that wonderful 0 number on the light meter every single time just because it tells you to, because again, your camera is not sentient, are you? No. I don't think you are. There's just they may claim that there's AI going on in here, but there's not much intelligence in any modern camera. Okay, so that is the metering modes. But there's one final tip that I learned from a professional photographer friend of mine who also uses a Sony camera like me, and well, genuinely, this was a complete game changer when I first started using it when I was out shooting, which is me most of the time, shooting sunsets, sunrises, high contrast landscape locations. He shared that there is a setting called zebras, which you can turn on in your camera settings, that flash on your camera screen when there are certain levels of brightness in the image, or essentially when the image is fully white and blown out. Now, you might be familiar with zebras already, but this photographer, my mate, uses them in a really interesting way. He sat down in his office and done lots of experimentation, and he found that when the zebra setting on his Sony a7R IV is set to around +107, the zebras only flash on screen at the point where you're actually blowing out the highlights and you're losing detail. So if you just take that image as a raw image, put it into Lightroom, at that point you've lost detail. So I use this all the time, and I kind of ignore the metering elements of my camera. I have the zebras on, and even if the meter is telling me that I'm overexposed, I know that my raw image still has a bunch of room to play with until those zebras start flashing. At that point, I know that if I take that shot right there, I'm going to be losing information in my highlights. They're going to be blown out. There is no way that I can pull them back in Lightroom without consequences. And that's pretty cool, right? So when I'm out shooting, I leave the zebras on constantly, and if they ever flash on my screen and I'm just about to take a photo, I know that I'm maxing out the sensor's dynamic range, and it's my hint, that more of a scream in your face from the back of the camera, to dial back the exposure just a little bit to make sure that I'm actually capturing everything. And if you want to capture more photography insights, hints and tips, why not click the video that's on the screen right now.